The private jet worth more than $120 million sat motionless inside the hangar, its engines silent, its cabin dark, its future uncertain. Outside, the tarmac shimmered under the afternoon sun, and inside the glass-walled operations center, more than 50 of the finest engineers from the most respected maintenance companies in the country shook their heads in unison. Every diagnostic they ran returned the same grim verdict. The aircraft needed at least 3 weeks of repair before it could safely leave the ground again. For Amelia Sterling, the chief executive of Sterling Aerospace, those 3 weeks might as well have been 3 lifetimes, because a multi-billion-dollar deal in Europe was hanging by a single thread, and that thread was this broken plane. As the tension in the hangar climbed toward panic, a man in a faded work jacket walked quietly through the crowd of specialists, carrying nothing but an old toolbox that looked like it belonged to another decade. He studied the diagnostic screen for only a few minutes before speaking in a voice so calm it silenced the room. "I can fix it," he said. When Amelia turned to face him and asked how much he wanted for the job, his answer was not what anyone expected. "Don't pay me a cent," he said. "Just cover my daughter's hospital bill." The entire hangar went still, and in that silence, a story neither of them could have predicted began to unfold. One that would eventually reach far beyond a single broken aircraft and into the buried history of an entire career. James Hayes was 38 years old, and to anyone watching him move through the hangar that morning, he looked like just another contract technician hired for the day, one face among dozens who came and went from the aviation industry without anyone remembering their names. He wore the same grease-stained jacket he had worn for years, carried a battered metal toolbox with a dented latch, and spoke to almost no one unless spoken to first. There was nothing about his appearance that suggested he had once been the youngest chief engineer in the history of a major aerospace corporation, a man whose name used to appear on patent filings and technical journals before it vanished from the industry entirely. Nobody in that hangar knew his history, and James preferred it that way. Because the version of himself that people once celebrated had cost him everything he loved. And he had spent years rebuilding a quieter, smaller life around the one thing that still mattered to him, his daughter. He took whatever contract work came his way, small repair jobs that paid enough to cover rent and medical appointments, never staying at any single company long enough for anyone to ask too many questions about his past. He had grown skilled at blending into crowds of specialists, speaking only when necessary, offering just enough competence to keep the work coming without ever revealing the depth of knowledge hiding beneath his quiet demeanor. Some mornings, standing in hangars filled with machinery he understood better than anyone else in the room, he felt an old, familiar ache, a reminder of everything he had built and everything that had been taken from him in a matter of weeks. He never spoke of it, not to co-workers, not to supervisors, and rarely even to himself, choosing instead to focus every ounce of his attention on the daughter waiting for him at home each evening. Amelia Sterling, 35 years old, was the kind of executive people described in a single breath as brilliant, decisive, and impossible to please. She had built Sterling Aerospace into one of the most respected names in private aviation through relentless attention to detail and an unwillingness to accept anything less than perfection from herself or from anyone around her. That morning, she had been minutes away from boarding her Gulfstream for a flight to Europe, where she intended to close a deal worth billions of dollars with a consortium of investors who did not tolerate delays. The jet had passed every routine check the night before. But as the engines spun up for departure, a warning light flashed red across the cockpit display, followed by a cascade of failures that grounded the aircraft immediately. The flight crew scrambled. Ground control was notified. Within the hour, mechanics from 3 different maintenance firms had been called in, each one more expensive and more confident than the last, and each one eventually admitting defeat. As the clock ticked toward the deadline for her overseas meeting, Amelia stood at the edge of the tarmac, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching her billion-dollar future slip away one diagnostic report at a time, and every specialist in that hangar delivered the same verdict without a hint of hesitation. It cannot be fixed today. Amelia had spent 15 years climbing to the top of an industry that rarely made room for women at her level, and every one of those years had taught her to trust preparation over luck and evidence over instinct. She had built her reputation on never allowing a single detail to slip past her. Reviewing contracts line by line long after her legal team had signed off, walking factory floors personally, rather than relying solely on reports from her executives. That discipline had carried Sterling Aerospace from a struggling regional charter company into one of the most respected names in private aviation. But it had also left her with very little patience for excuses and even less patience for failure she could not explain. Standing on that tarmac, watching millions of dollars in expertise fail to produce a single working theory, she felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel in public. A genuine and unfamiliar sense of helplessness. The hangar buzzed with the frantic energy of professionals who had never encountered a problem they could not solve. And that unfamiliar feeling made everyone increasingly desperate. Engineers pulled apart entire component clusters one by one, replacing circuit boards, swapping out sensors, running diagnostic software that spat out contradictory results every few minutes. One team insisted the failure originated in the electronic control unit, convinced that a faulty chip was sending corrupted signals throughout the aircraft's systems. Another team disagreed entirely, arguing that a fuel sensor malfunction was the true culprit. And they began dismantling fuel lines that had been perfectly functional just hours earlier. A third group, growing impatient with both theories, proposed replacing the entire flight control system, a repair that would cost millions of dollars and take far longer than the 3 weeks already estimated. The arguments grew louder, the whiteboard covered in crossed-out theories, and every new attempt only added more zeros to an already staggering repair bill. Vendors were called in to quote replacement parts that would take days to ship, and one contractor even suggested flying in a specialist from overseas, a proposal that would have added another full week to an already impossible timeline. Voices grew sharper as the morning wore on, each engineer defending his own theory, with the kind of stubborn pride that made collaboration nearly impossible. And more than once, a shouting match broke out over whose diagnostic equipment could actually be trusted. Assistants ran back and forth between the hangar and the operations center, delivering updated cost estimates that climbed higher with each revision until the projected repair bill had grown large enough to rival the price of a modest airliner. Amelia watched from the observation deck above the hangar floor, her phone buzzing with messages from her overseas partners, asking why the meeting had been postponed twice already, and she could feel the deal slipping through her fingers with every passing minute. Far from the chaos, near the loading dock where spare parts were delivered, James stood quietly beside a supply cart, watching the scene unfold with the trained eye of a man who had seen 1,000 failures dressed up as impossible mysteries. He said nothing at first, content to observe, because he had learned long ago that unsolicited opinions from a man in a worn jacket rarely earned anyone's respect. Then, almost under his breath, he spoke 5 words that nobody expected to hear. "It's not the flight control system." Every head in the hangar turned toward him at once. And for a moment, nobody moved, as if the sentence itself had frozen the room in place. One of the senior engineers, a tall man named Robert Chase, who had led his firm's most prestigious accounts for over a decade, stepped forward with a mixture of irritation and disbelief written across his face. "Do you think you're smarter than 50 engineers standing in this room?" he asked, his tone sharp enough to draw a few nervous laughs from the crowd behind him. Robert had spent 20 years building his firm into one of the most trusted names in aviation maintenance, and the idea that a man in a stained work jacket might undo that reputation in front of a room full of witnesses struck him as almost insulting. He crossed his arms and glanced around at his colleagues, clearly expecting someone to back him up, but the room had grown quieter than he anticipated, the earlier confidence of the morning replaced by a cautious curiosity nobody wanted to admit out loud. James did not flinch, and he did not raise his voice to match the challenge. Instead, he walked calmly toward the diagnostic terminal, glanced at the readouts scrolling across the screen, and began explaining, in measured and precise language, why the problem was not in the software, was not in the engine, and was not in the electronic control unit that everyone had spent hours dismantling. The failure, he explained, was an extremely small voltage fluctuation occurring between 2 synchronization modules, a discrepancy so minor that it would never appear under standard testing conditions. It only manifested, he continued, under a very specific combination of temperature and humidity. Precisely the conditions the hangar had experienced that particular morning due to a sudden weather shift. Nobody believed him. The room fell into a kind of stunned, skeptical silence, the sound of 50 trained professionals trying to decide whether they had just witnessed brilliance or nonsense, and Amelia stepped down from the observation deck to get a closer look at the stranger who had just contradicted every expert she was paying by the hour. "Are you certain?" she asked, studying him with the same intensity she used when evaluating a business proposal that could make or break her company. James held her gaze without wavering, and there was nothing arrogant in his expression, only a quiet, unshakable confidence that came from years of experience nobody in that room knew he possessed. "I am very certain," he said, and something in the steadiness of his voice made Amelia pause. She had built an entire career on reading people quickly, on separating genuine expertise from confident bluffing, and every instinct she had spent years sharpening told her that the man standing in front of her was not guessing. Still, the stakes were enormous, and handing control of a multi-million-dollar aircraft to an unknown contractor was not a decision she could make lightly, especially with 50 credentialed engineers standing in the room, ready to dispute his every word. She glanced at the clock on the far wall, then back at James, weighing the cost of trusting a stranger against the cost of losing the deal entirely, and in that suspended moment, the entire hangar seemed to hold its breath waiting for her decision. "If you can fix it," she finally asked, "how much do you want?" James did not hesitate, and his answer was so simple that it caught everyone in the hangar off guard. "Pay my daughter's hospital bill," he said. "Not a fee, not a percentage, not a bonus tied to the success of the repair, not equity in the company, not a lump sum of cash that most contractors in his position would have demanded without a second thought." The room fell silent again, this time not out of skepticism but out of genuine surprise, because nobody in that hangar had ever heard a request like it. Amelia studied his face carefully, searching for some sign of a hidden agenda, some indication that this was a negotiating tactic designed to appear humble before revealing a much larger demand later. She found none. "That's all?" she asked, her voice softer now than it had been all morning. James nodded once, his expression unreadable to everyone except perhaps himself. "If I fail today," he said, "I walk away with nothing." The atmosphere in the hangar shifted in a way that was difficult to describe but impossible to ignore, as though the air itself had grown lighter. And for the first time since the crisis began, Amelia looked at the stranger in front of her not as another contractor to be managed, but as a man carrying something far heavier than a broken aircraft. "Give him full access," she said to her team, her voice carrying the same authority it always did, but with an undertone that suggested this decision meant more to her than the deal itself. James got to work without a trace of urgency, moving through the aircraft's systems with the unhurried precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and refused to be rushed by the anxiety filling the room around him. He did not replace a single component, and he did not call for any of the expensive diagnostic equipment the other firms had used throughout the morning, choosing instead to rely on instruments from his own worn toolbox, tools he had carried with him through every job he had taken since leaving the industry behind. A few of the younger engineers exchanged skeptical glances when they saw the simplicity of his equipment, clearly expecting the outdated instruments to fail where their expensive machines had already failed, but they said nothing, unwilling to interrupt a man who had already proven he understood something they did not. Instead, he measured signal patterns by hand, adjusted the synchronization sequence between the two modules he had identified earlier, recalibrated the voltage regulation with tools that looked almost primitive compared to the machinery scattered across the hangar floor, and rewrote several lines of configuration code directly into the aircraft's control system. The engineers who had spent hours arguing over theories began to gather around him, watching in a silence that slowly transformed from doubt into something closer to awe, because none of them had considered the possibility he was pursuing. James explained his reasoning as he worked, describing the underlying physics of the failure with a depth of knowledge that made even the most experienced specialists in the room realize they were watching something far beyond routine maintenance. Amelia stood off to the side, arms no longer crossed, watching the man work with an intensity that had nothing to do with the deadline pressing down on her. The longer she listened, the more astonished she became. Not just by his technical skill, but by the calm, deliberate way he carried himself. As though nothing about this crisis frightened him in the slightest. After nearly an hour of careful, methodical work, James stepped back from the console, wiped his hands on a cloth from his toolbox, and gave a single nod toward the flight crew standing nearby. The engines roared to life. The warning lights, one by one, disappeared from the display. The flight crew rushed back into the cockpit, running through the same checklist that had failed disastrously just hours earlier. And this time, every single reading came back clean. Fuel pressure, engine temperature, synchronization signals, electrical output. All of it fell perfectly within range, as though the aircraft had never malfunctioned at all. The senior engineers who had spent the entire morning dismantling components in search of an answer stood frozen at the edge of the hangar, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had believed only an hour before. The jet was towed out onto the runway, its engines humming with the steady, confident rhythm of a machine in perfect working order. And within minutes it lifted off the ground and disappeared into the afternoon sky, carrying Amelia toward the deal that would define the next chapter of her company's future. The hangar erupted into a mixture of relief and disbelief, engineers shaking their heads in quiet astonishment, murmuring to one another about the stranger who had solved in 1 hour what 50 professionals could not solve in an entire morning. Sterling Aerospace avoided a financial loss that would have run into the billions. And word of what had happened began to spread quietly through the company's leadership before the plane had even crossed the Atlantic. By the time Amelia landed in Europe and stepped off the aircraft onto the tarmac outside her waiting partners, the story of the mysterious contractor who had solved an unsolvable problem had already reached the ears of her board of directors, several of whom sent messages demanding to know exactly who this man was and why nobody at the company had ever heard his name before that morning. Reporters who covered the aviation industry began quietly asking questions as well, sensing that something unusual had taken place inside that hangar, though none of them yet understood how deep the story actually ran. James, characteristically indifferent to the attention suddenly directed his way, packed his toolbox without a word, and began walking toward the hangar exit, ready to disappear back into the anonymous life he had built for himself over the past several years. He had almost reached the door when a voice called out behind him, sharp enough to stop him mid-step. "Mr. Hayes," Amelia said, her voice carrying across the now quiet hangar. "I want to know who you really are." James turned slowly, and for the first time that day, something in his composed expression flickered, as though the question had reached somewhere deeper than he intended to let anyone touch. He said nothing for a long moment, and in that silence, Amelia understood that the man standing before her was carrying a story far more complicated than a broken aircraft and an unpaid hospital bill. Amelia's curiosity did not fade after the plane landed safely in Europe, and the billion-dollar deal was signed without a single complication. If anything, the mystery of James Hayes followed her across the ocean and back, lingering in her thoughts long after the celebratory dinners and handshakes had ended. Within days of returning home, she quietly instructed her legal and research teams to look into his background, expecting, at most, to uncover a modest career in aviation maintenance that had somehow produced an unusually gifted technician. What they found instead reshaped everything she thought she understood about the man who had saved her company. James Hayes, it turned out, had once been the youngest chief engineer in the history of a major aerospace corporation, a prodigy whose name had been attached to dozens of patents involving synchronization systems remarkably similar to the very technology he had repaired in her hangar. He had been considered, by nearly everyone who worked with him at the time, one of the most brilliant minds the industry had produced in a generation, a man whose innovations were expected to define the next several decades of commercial aviation. And then, seemingly overnight, his name disappeared entirely from every professional record, every industry publication, every conference roster where it had once been prominently featured. Amelia sat at her desk late into the night, reading through the research her team had compiled. unable to reconcile the ambitious, celebrated engineer described in old industry articles with the quiet, humble man who had asked for nothing more than a hospital bill. The deeper her team dug, the more troubling the story became. Years earlier, at the height of his career, James had been blamed for a catastrophic failure during a high-profile aircraft testing program, an incident that resulted in significant damage to a prototype and nearly cost several engineers their lives. At the time, the investigation concluded that James had approved a critical component, despite data suggesting it was unsafe, a finding that destroyed his reputation within months and led to his quiet, humiliating exit from the company he had helped build. He lost his position, his standing in the industry, and virtually every professional relationship he had spent a decade cultivating, all in the span of a single testing failure that was never quite explained to anyone's full satisfaction. What nobody outside a small circle knew, and what Amelia's investigators were only beginning to piece together, was that the safety data used to blame James had been deliberately altered by colleagues eager to protect their own careers and shift responsibility away from decisions they themselves had made. James had tried, in the immediate aftermath, to defend himself, presenting his own records and calculations to company leadership, but by then the narrative had already hardened into fact, and nobody was willing to reconsider a conclusion that had already been made public. Rather than continue fighting a battle he had no resources left to win, James walked away from the industry entirely, taking whatever work he could find that allowed him to provide for his family, without ever stepping back into the spotlight that had destroyed him. He vanished from the world that once celebrated him. And for years afterward, nobody in the aerospace industry knew whether he was still alive, let alone still working with his hands on the very machines that had once defined his career. She read through old photographs attached to the file, images of a much younger James standing beside prototype aircraft, with a proud, confident smile that looked nothing like the guarded expression he now wore every day, and something about the contrast unsettled her more than she expected. She thought about the many mornings she had walked past contractors in her own hangars without ever once asking their names, trusting instead the credentials printed neatly on a clipboard, and she wondered how many other stories like his had slipped through the same cracks over the years. Amelia closed the file late that night, sitting alone in her office with the quiet weight of what she had just learned settling over her, and she whispered to herself, the only sentence that felt adequate to the moment. "We let a genius disappear," she said, "and none of us ever noticed." Unable to leave the matter unresolved, Amelia authorized a full independent investigation into the incident that had ended James's career, determined to uncover exactly what had happened all those years ago, regardless of what it might reveal about people still working within the industry today. Her team spent weeks combing through archived records that had been buried in storage facilities for over a decade, recovering old security footage, internal emails, testing logs, and witness statements that had never been properly reviewed during the original investigation. What they uncovered painted a picture entirely different from the one that had ended James's career. The safety data blamed for the testing failure had, in fact, been quietly altered by two senior engineers who feared that their own miscalculations would be exposed if the truth came to light, and they had used James's relative youth and rapid rise through the company as convenient cover for their own mistakes. Internal emails recovered from the archived servers showed a clear pattern of manipulation, messages coordinating how to present falsified reports to company leadership, discussions about ensuring James would be the one held accountable, and even references to research findings that had been quietly stolen from projects he had personally developed. Former colleagues who had remained silent for years, afraid of jeopardizing their own careers, came forward once the investigation gained momentum, offering testimony that corroborated everything the recovered documents suggested. Piece by piece, the truth assembled itself into an undeniable picture, one that confirmed what Amelia had already begun to suspect in her heart, that James Hayes had been innocent all along, sacrificed to protect the reputations of men who never deserved the careers they built on his downfall. The revelation sent a wave of shock through the aerospace industry, particularly once it became clear how many of the falsified findings had influenced safety protocols still in use at other companies years later. Amelia, unwilling to let the truth remain buried in a legal filing somewhere, made the decision to bring the entire story into the open, scheduling a press conference that would finally set the record straight after more than a decade of silence. The press conference took place on a bright morning outside the headquarters of Sterling Aerospace, with reporters from every major industry publication gathered to hear an announcement that had been described only vaguely in advance as a significant correction to the historical record. Amelia stood at the podium, with the composed authority that had defined her entire career, but there was something different in her voice that morning, a rawness that even seasoned journalists in the audience could not help but notice. She spoke first about the incident from years earlier, laying out in careful detail the falsified data, the manipulated reports, and the deliberate effort to protect certain individuals at the expense of an innocent man's career. She named the engineers responsible, presented the recovered evidence for the record, and confirmed that Sterling Aerospace's legal team was pursuing formal action against everyone involved in the original cover-up. Then, turning toward a quiet figure standing near the edge of the stage, she introduced James Hayes not as a contractor, not as a technician, but as the man whose brilliance had once been stolen from him by people unwilling to accept responsibility for their own failures. The room fell into a hush as James stepped forward, visibly uncomfortable with the attention but standing tall for the first time in over a decade. No longer hiding behind an unremarkable jacket and an anonymous toolbox, Amelia turned to face him directly, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly building beneath it, and she offered a public apology on behalf of an industry that had failed him and a company that had, until recently, never known his name. The cameras captured the moment in silence, and across the industry, professionals who had once dismissed rumors of a forgotten prodigy began to understand exactly how much had been lost and exactly how much was finally being restored. Reporters who had spent the morning expecting a routine corporate announcement found themselves scrambling to update headlines that no longer captured the scale of what had just occurred, and by evening the story had spread across every major aviation publication in the country, each one revisiting the decade-old case with fresh scrutiny. Former colleagues of James, some of whom had stayed silent out of fear and others out of simple indifference, began reaching out privately in the days that followed, offering apologies that arrived years too late but that James accepted anyway, understanding better than most the cost of admitting a painful truth. In the weeks following the press conference, Amelia made good on every promise she had made to James back in the hangar, ensuring that his daughter's hospital bill was paid in full without a single condition attached, exactly as he had originally requested. But she did not stop there. She worked with her legal team to formally clear his name from every industry record where the falsified findings had once appeared, restoring his reputation piece by piece until the story of his downfall was replaced with the far more accurate story of his resilience. She also extended an offer that surprised even her own board of directors, inviting James to join Sterling Aerospace as the company's new chief technology officer, a position that would place him at the very center of the industry that had once cast him out. James hesitated for several days before responding, and when he finally sat down with Amelia to discuss the offer, his reluctance was clear in every word he spoke. He explained that he no longer trusted an industry that had so easily discarded him, that the wounds from those years had never fully healed, no matter how much time had passed, or how much his reputation had been restored on paper. Amelia listened carefully, understanding his hesitation more than he realized. And when she finally responded, her words carried none of the corporate polish she typically used in negotiations. "You wouldn't be coming back for the industry," she told him. "You would be coming back for the young engineers out there who deserve the chance to learn from the best person this field has ever produced." James sat with her words for a long moment, considering everything he had lost and everything he might still be able to give to people who had not yet had the chance to make the same mistakes that once cost him everything. He thought of the years he had spent quietly repairing machines in hangars nobody remembered his name from, of the countless nights he had come home exhausted, wondering whether the industry he once loved would ever have room for him again, and of his daughter, who had never once complained about the modest life they shared together despite everything they had lost. Slowly, he nodded, and for the first time in over a decade, James Hayes agreed to step back into the world he thought he had left behind for good. The transition was not immediate, and it was not without its difficulties. But James settled into his new role with the same quiet determination that had defined every chapter of his life. He began leading a team of young engineers at Sterling Aerospace, many of them barely out of graduate school, all of them eager to absorb every piece of knowledge this soft-spoken man seemed willing to share. Under his guidance, the company's engineering division began developing a new generation of synchronization technology, building directly on the innovations James had pioneered years earlier before his career was so unjustly interrupted. He insisted on mentoring every new hire personally during their first few months, walking them through failures as patiently as he walked them through successes, often reminding them that the best engineers were not the ones who avoided mistakes, but the ones who understood exactly why those mistakes happened. His office, unlike the sleek, minimalist spaces occupied by other executives at Sterling Aerospace, remained cluttered with the same worn tools he had carried through years of anonymous contract work. A reminder to himself and to everyone who visited that expertise did not require polish to be real. Word of the breakthroughs spread quickly through the industry, and Sterling Aerospace's reputation climbed to new heights, driven not by aggressive marketing or corporate maneuvering, but by genuine technical excellence that James had quietly reintroduced into the company's culture. For James, the recognition mattered less than the simple fact of being trusted again, of watching young engineers approach their work with curiosity rather than fear, of finally reclaiming a sense of purpose that had been stolen from him for far too long. Amelia watched his transformation from a distance at first, then increasingly from much closer, finding herself drawn not just to his brilliance, but to the humility with which he carried it, a quality she had rarely encountered in an industry built on ego and ambition. She began to understand that what she admired most about James was not simply his technical genius, though that alone would have been enough to earn her respect, but the quiet integrity that had guided every decision he made, even during the darkest years of his life, when nobody was watching and nothing would have stopped him from cutting corners. Over the following months, the professional respect between Amelia and James gradually deepened into something neither of them had expected to find in a hangar filled with broken machinery and desperate engineers. Their conversations, which once revolved entirely around technical specifications and project deadlines, began to stretch into longer discussions about the years they had each spent rebuilding themselves after loss, about the sacrifices required to protect the people they loved, and about the strange, quiet strength it took to keep moving forward when everything familiar had been taken away. There was no dramatic declaration of feeling between them, no sudden confession that changed the nature of their relationship overnight, because both of them had lived enough life to understand, through consistency and trust, rather than grand gestures. Amelia found herself looking forward to their late evening conversations after the rest of the office had gone home, conversations that started with engineering problems and often ended with James talking quietly about his daughter, about the years he had spent working small, forgettable jobs just to keep her safe and cared for. James, in turn, found himself trusting Amelia in a way he had not trusted anyone since the day his career fell apart, drawn not to her authority or her success, but to the quiet honesty she showed him, even when it would have been easier to look away. Two people who had each spent years learning to stand alone slowly discovered that they no longer had to, and their bond grew not out of desperation or convenience, but out of a mutual respect that had been earned through honesty, patience, and time. On quiet weekends, Amelia sometimes found herself at James's small house on the edge of the city, conversations drifting easily between engineering problems and ordinary family stories, and she realized how long it had been since she felt at home anywhere outside her own office. James, in turn, began attending company events he once would have avoided entirely, standing beside Amelia not as an employee trailing behind an executive, but as an equal whose opinion she sought out before making decisions that would shape the company's future. Colleagues who watched the two of them together noticed the subtle shift long before either of them spoke of it openly: the easy laughter, the shared glances across crowded rooms, the quiet way James would pull out a chair for her without being asked. Neither of them rushed to define what was growing between them, content instead to let it unfold naturally. The same way James approached every complicated problem he had ever solved, with patience, precision, and an unwavering trust in the process. By the time a full year had passed since the morning James walked into that hangar with nothing but an old toolbox and a quiet request. Everything about his life had changed beyond recognition. The engineers who once falsified data to protect their own reputations had been formally charged. Their professional licenses revoked, their careers ended in the same abrupt and public manner that had once ended James's own career, except this time the outcome was built on truth rather than lies. Both men eventually pleaded no contest to charges of fraud and evidence tampering. Their sentencing hearings drawing a small crowd of former colleagues who had once looked the other way and now sat quietly in the gallery, unwilling to meet the eyes of the man they had wronged so many years earlier. James did not attend either hearing, choosing instead to spend that time at home with his daughter, telling her once again that the truth, however long it took to surface, was always worth waiting for. His daughter's hospital bill had long since been paid, her health fully restored after months of treatment that James had quietly financed through years of overtime work and careful sacrifice long before the day he ever set foot in Amelia's hangar. She had grown into a bright, curious teenager who often visited her father's new office after school, fascinated by the machines he now spent his days perfecting alongside a growing team of talented young engineers, and she liked to sit quietly in the corner of his workspace, doing homework, while listening to him explain complicated systems to colleagues twice her age. James often said that watching her walk through those halls, healthy and unafraid, meant more to him than any patent or title the industry could ever offer him again. Sterling Aerospace stood stronger than it had ever been, its innovations once again setting the standard for an industry that had nearly lost one of its greatest minds to silence and neglect. James no longer walked through hangars unnoticed, and though the attention still occasionally made him uncomfortable, he had come to understand that his story now served a purpose far greater than his own redemption, offering proof to every young engineer he mentored that talent could survive even the deepest injustice. Amelia, once known throughout the industry for her relentless perfectionism and guarded independence, had learned something she had never expected to learn from a man in a faded work jacket, that true partnership required trusting someone enough to let them see the parts of yourself that success alone could never reveal. She thought back often to that morning in the hangar, to the version of herself who had once measured every person by their price and every deal by its numbers, and she realized how much that single encounter had quietly reshaped the way she led her company and the way she chose to live her life. Together, they built not only a stronger company, but a life defined by mutual respect, quiet loyalty, and the kind of steady devotion that neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding again. In the end, the story that began with a broken aircraft and an impossible deadline became something far larger than either of them could have imagined that morning, a reminder that true greatness is never measured by the price a person demands, but by the sacrifices they are willing to make for the people they love. Years later, when young engineers at Sterling Aerospace asked James how he had managed to hold on to his skill and his integrity through so many difficult years of obscurity, he would simply smile and tell them that the hardest part was never the engineering itself, but choosing, every single day, to remain the kind of man worth trusting again. And somewhere in that answer, quiet and unassuming as the man who gave it, lived the entire truth of everything that had happened since the morning a single dad walked into a hangar and asked for nothing more than his daughter's life to be saved.